All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're going to map out the timeline, the sheer scale, and the core strategic objectives of the U.S.-led military operations against Iran that took place across 2025 and 2026. And we're going to examine this strictly through the lens of U.S. policy and public statements, so we can really understand exactly how the American government and military approached this massive geopolitical event.
To really wrap our heads around the magnitude of this conflict, we have to start with one absolutely staggering number: 13,000. That's the number of Iranian targets struck by the U.S. military. The buildup to this was immense. We're literally talking about the largest deployment of American air, naval, and missile defense assets in the Middle East since the invasion of Iraq back in 2003. And the timeline of this buildup was incredibly rapid and, honestly, pretty alarming. In January and February of 2026, the U.S. virtual embassy in Iran started firing off escalating security alerts, basically telling Americans to get out via open land borders. Then, on February 23rd, non-emergency personnel were ordered out of Lebanon. Just 4 days later, a departure order hits Israel. And literally the very next day, the military strikes commence.
But, to understand why the U.S. positioned all these forces and launched the campaign in early 2026, we actually need to rewind the clock a bit to February 4th, 2025. That is when President Trump signed National Security Presidential Memorandum 2, or NSPM 2 for short. This document is crucial because it laid the entire foundation for the conflict by institutionalizing this policy of maximum pressure on Iran. The goal? Compel the regime to completely abandon its nuclear program and its support for proxies.
Now, this maximum pressure strategy wasn't just some isolated military plan. It was a completely coordinated, whole-of-government mandate. Every single lever of American power was pulled at the exact same time. You had the Treasury Department enforcing strict maritime sanctions. The State Department was actively driving Iranian crude oil exports down to absolute zero. Commerce was restricting dual-use tech to essentially starve their military-industrial base. And the Justice Department, they were impounding illicit oil cargoes and indicting proxy leaders.
What's really fascinating here, though, is a pretty stark contrast we see in the intelligence assessments following some earlier strikes in June 2025, an operation known as Midnight Hammer. Publicly, U.S. officials claimed that nuclear sites at Natanz, Fordo, and Isfahan sustained severe damage, supposedly setting the Iranian nuclear program back by about 2 years. But a leaked Defense Intelligence Agency, or DIA, assessment offered a much more conservative view. The DIA basically said, well, the sites were damaged but not destroyed, and the program was only delayed by a few months. That's a huge discrepancy.
Following those 2025 strikes and the really tight squeeze of U.S. sanctions, Iran suffered a massive economic collapse. The Iranian rial just crashed, which triggered these huge nationwide anti-government protests. In response, the regime throws up an internet blackout and initiates a violently harsh internal crackdown. According to the sources we're looking at, it's estimated that over 2,615 protesters were killed by late 2025. A really grim reality on the ground.
So, the White House definitely seized on this instability. In his 2026 State of the Union address, President Trump explicitly pointed to this internal unrest, combining it with intelligence that suggested Iran was trying to rebuild its, quote, sinister nuclear weapons program. The administration used those two factors as the direct, explicit justification for the massive military buildup that followed in early 2026. And all of this pressure finally escalated to a breaking point. On February 28, 2026, the U.S. military, operating right alongside Israel, unleashed a preemptive, massive combat campaign, Operation Epic Fury. These strikes went after Iranian officials, military commanders, and widespread military assets across the board.
The U.S. viewpoint on Epic Fury was highly focused. The president went out and explicitly detailed the strategic goals to the public. The endgame was basically to permanently dismantle the Iranian regime's ability to project power. The priorities were absolutely uncompromising: destroy the missile capabilities, annihilate the Navy, and ensure the regime could never, ever obtain a nuclear weapon. And you've got to look at how unified this messaging was across the administration. From Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt to Secretary of State Marco Rubio, the talking points were virtually identical. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth repeated these exact same goals pretty much word for word, stating that the mission was laser-focused on obliterating missiles, annihilating the Navy, and severing the nuclear pathway.
So essentially, every single tactical action taken by the U.S. during this operation was strictly anchored to 4 core objectives.
It wasn't just blind retaliation. It was a highly systematic effort to raise Iran's defense industrial base, neutralize its maritime presence, end its support for terror proxies, and just permanently close the door on any nuclear ambitions. Now, how do you actually achieve those four objectives? By leveraging overwhelming military might. During the course of Operation Epic Fury, U.S. forces flew an unbelievable 10,200 total air sorties. Think about that for a second. It was just a relentless campaign to establish complete and total control of the skies, exactly the way the president had described it. If we break down those 13,000 targets we talked about at the beginning, you really see this systematic dismantling at play. 2,000 command and control targets, 1,500 air defense systems, nearly 1,450 defense and industrial base targets, and over 600 naval targets. U.S. Central Command essentially worked their way down a checklist explicitly designed to completely cripple the regime's hard power. But keep in mind, this wasn't purely an offensive show. While actively striking Iran, U.S. and partner forces simultaneously had to mount a massive defense against retaliatory waves. They successfully intercepted over 1,000 incoming attack drones and more than 700 ballistic missiles launched by Iran and its proxy groups. It was a two-way fight. Throughout all of this chaos, the White House maintained a very specific geopolitical stance. Their argument was that this overwhelming fury gave the U.S. maximum leverage to negotiate from a position of absolute undeniable strength. On top of that, President Trump even suggested that these unprecedented strikes might weaken the Iranian regime just enough to facilitate its collapse, maybe even sparking an overthrow by a popular revolt from within. However, geopolitical pushback wasn't just happening on the international stage, it was bubbling up right at home. On June 23, 2026, the U.S. Senate narrowly passed a binding act with a super tight 50-48 vote. This act essentially mandated that the United States either end its war operations or officially seek explicit congressional consent to continue fighting. It was a clear signal of growing domestic friction over this extended conflict. And that domestic friction really mirrored a broader pattern of how these intense escalations are ultimately contained. If we look back at the earlier phase, often called the 12-day war, we see this distinct rhythm of massive escalation followed by a sudden halt. For instance, following U.S. strikes on nuclear facilities on June 22nd, Iran launched a retaliatory hit on the Al Udeid air base in Qatar on June 23rd, literally the same day as that Senate vote. But just hours after that base strike, a sudden ceasefire was announced on June 24th, bringing active hostilities to an abrupt, negotiated pause. Real whiplash. So, as we wrap up this explainer and look back at the stated U.S. goals versus the military action taken, we are left with a pretty critical question. The United States undoubtedly achieved immense, immediate, tactical destruction across Iran's military infrastructure. But what are the long-term ramifications here? Did Operation Epic Fury permanently neutralize the threat like it was intended to, or did it simply set the stage for the next highly volatile era of geopolitical conflict in the Middle East? It's something we're going to have to watch closely. Thanks so much for tuning in, and as always, keep asking questions.